Can I welcome you all here this evening? We're really delighted to see so many people here. We've had a very large registration. I'm just going to say two or three things before introducing my colleague Donatas Kupciunas, who in turn will introduce our speaker and author. First point, this is all being videoed and recorded. It's not going out live, it's not a live feed, but it will go up onto our website in the next 2 or 3 days. And I just want to alert you to that, to be aware of it, if you're contributing, asking questions or whatever, so you know that that is the case. Secondly, I want to give thanks to the Lithuanian Embassy for funding some of this event this evening, including some of the excellent product that I hope we'll consume after the talk. And it's very good of them to do so. We've had good relations with a number of the Baltic country embassies, and it is important to us that they've been able to help us in things of this type. The third thing I want to say is entirely personal. I got involved in all of this because my wife's mother was Estonian. She fled Estonia in September 1944 in front of the Russians. Her uncle, a man called Ulo Marama, was a campaigner against the Soviets and for Estonian independence. And he's in fact mentioned in this book on page 37, which I didn't know until I read it. But he tried to organize an Estonian resistance against the Soviet invasion. They tried to put up candidates in the fake elections, which the Soviets then held and won unanimously. But as a result, he and his group were arrested by the KGB, and he was then shot in early 1941. And it's an incredible story of what happens, what led me to understand the importance of this part of the world as somebody who knew very little about it, other than through my relationship with my wife. And I'm so delighted, it's one of the reasons that led me to get involved in setting up the Baltic Geopolitics program here at Cambridge. And I'm so delighted that Dan has written this extraordinary book, I think the most substantial book in English on the Forest Brotherhood. Again, one of my wife's mother's sister's husband was a Lutheran priest and a Forest brother over this period. And so I'm really looking forward to this talk. Our Baltic Geopolitics program in the Centre of Geopolitics here at Cambridge University has been going since January 2021. We'd absolutely welcome the involvement of any of you in it on the website which you registered, and we're trying to build understanding and awareness of what is the importance of the Baltic. Of course, we set it up in January 2021, but after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the whole subject obviously took on a massively increased salience, and there has been a wide degree of interest. We do a lot of activities around the world. We had an event in Copenhagen last week, for example, and we're really delighted you've come this evening. So thank you for coming, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Donatas Kupciunas, who's going to conduct affairs this evening.
Thank you, Charles. Good evening, everyone. I'm Donatas. I'm a Baltic Fellow at the Center for Geopolitics. I'm a historian, I'm a modernist, but I'm not a specialist in anti-Soviet or anti-Nazi resistance. And I guess my expertise tonight stems from the fact that I come from the region itself. And these stories that Dan will be speaking about tonight, there's something that's really familiar to anyone who comes from that part of the world. When I first saw Dan's book, I thought, that's interesting, you know, an American Pole writing a history about the Forest Brothers, you know, that doesn't happen too often. And then it just dawned on me that actually the surname Kašėta can also be read as Kašėta, which is like a proper Lithuanian surname. And there was even an MP in Lithuania.
Yes, my second cousin.
Exactly, and I was going to tell a joke about him, but then I talked to Dan, and then I realized he's his relative, so I'll do that later.
Yes,
But so essentially, what you're going to have tonight is two Lithuanians discussing this very complex, this very controversial, and I must say this very painful chapter of Baltic history. Every family has stories to tell about that, every family in the Baltic. And just, you know, to to tell something about my personal experience. My wife's uncle was a partisan. He was killed somewhere in the end of the 40s or in the beginning of the 50s. And the Soviets let his body to decompose on the market square. They wouldn't let, the relatives to pick it up and to bury it. So it stayed for like 2 weeks there. And then the relatives somehow, the grandma of my wife, she managed to take that body somehow and she managed to bury it in the Jewish cemetery. So they made a deal with a Jewish shopkeeper who was somehow still alive after the Holocaust, because Lithuanian cemeteries were off limits for these guys, for the partisans, and then so it's very ironic actually. So without further ado, just two things that I'd like to say in the beginning. So first of all, this event is being filmed and it will be available on our YouTube channel shortly. The second thing I want to tell is that after the session you'll be able to ask questions, and if you ask clever questions and if you buy Dan's book, then Dan will be able to sign it. So without further ado, Dan, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for having me here, Charles, to Cambridge. A long way for a Lithuanian American who grew up in Arizona to come here to speak at Cambridge. But and I also want to thank my publisher, Hearst Publishers. We have a representative from Hearst Publishers here, Raminta, who will be glad to take your money for one of my books. Also, publisher of Charles's book, Understanding the Baltic States. Now, the first thing I will tell you is I'm not actually a historian of the Baltic states. I grew up with this as a part of the family folklore, family history, and interest. I've spent most of my career as a specialist in chemical and biological terrorism, and that led me to sort of evolve into the military historian of record on that subject. But then, of course, we have a land war in Eastern Europe for the first time in a while, at least the first time since the Balkan conflict. And my publisher says, well, we really need to get more books on this area out, so have you got a book in you? And I said, well, what about these Baltic partisans? And Michael Dwyer, who is the head of Hearst, says, is that really a thing? I said, it's very much a thing. Is it important? It's very important. And so my chat tonight and the purpose of my book is to explain that, yes, indeed, it was a thing and it was important, and for reasons that not everybody necessarily understands unless you start to really sort of get your grips into it. And so I think the best thing I could do is really just sort of launch into, I think if you've made it this far, you probably know that where these countries are we're talking about. We're talking about 3 countries on the eastern shore of the Baltic Sea. Estonia on the top, Latvia in the middle, Lithuania on the bottom. It is only by matter of sort of modern convention that we don't refer to Finland as a Baltic state. We probably could. It shares much of its history and culture with Estonia. It shares some of the same history in a lot of ways, and it's struggled to escape Soviet domination, its earlier struggles to escape the Tsarist Empire. But for whatever reason, we refer to the Baltic states as these three countries. They're all quite different from each other. There's a tendency to try to sort of lump them together as those Baltic places, and it's a quite interesting feedback I find from sort of travelers or Americans or British people or Western Europeans who go there for the first time and do a sort of tour amongst them. There's a lot of things in common, and there's a lot of things that are actually quite separate. I'm going to give you a tiny little sort of strike through history. I'm going to give you about 90 seconds of potted back history. What you see on the left is the sort of high water mark of what I would call the Lithuanian Empire. It was really, well, the Grand Duchy. In the Middle Ages, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was a big thing. Okay, and much of what we now call Belarus, much of what we call Ukraine, was under domination under Lithuanian domination and Lithuanian nobles. There was a rapid expansion. But the Lithuanians have this vast back history that they look at with some grandeur. People grow up in Lithuania with names of old Grand Dukes, Vytautas, Gediminas, Algirdis. It's very common to name your son after one of these Grand Dukes out of history. And the Lithuanians, for a variety of reasons, mostly geographic, were quite isolated from the rest of Europe. It comes as a shock to many people that the Lithuanians were the last major pocket of paganism in Europe. The Lithuanians converted to Christianity from paganism only in the 1380s, arguably much later in some other parts of Lithuania where it sort of held out in the backwoods. And so it converted to Catholicism a good 400 years after their neighboring Poles had. And this a shared religion and a shared enemy, the Teutonic Knights, the crusading order of Germanic knights, gave Lithuania a very commingled and complicated history with the Poles. We could have an entire night on talking about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Confederation, Joint Kingdom, whatever you want to call it. I highly recommend Melvin Bragg's In Your Time episode on that from about 4 years ago. He did a very good 1 hour on the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Latvians and Estonians, their history is a little bit different. One way you can look at the Latvians and Estonians is they were early victims of German colonialism. The crusading Teutonic Knights effectively colonized and Christianized the areas that we now call Lithuania and Latvia. They had a number of different names, including Livonia or Courland. And as you can see from that map on the right, a lot of these were basically ecclesiastical states under bishops and archbishops and large estates run by crusading orders of knights. And it's interesting that you say crusades. Everybody thinks about the Middle Ages, crusades, going to the Holy Land. There's this whole thing called the Northern Crusades because it wasn't logistically feasible. This is a bit of a simplification. I'm not a Crusades historian, but there was a period of time where it wasn't logistically feasible to go to the Middle East, to go to the Holy Land in Israel, to Palestine, to crusade. There were entire decades where that wasn't possible. But there was this whole infrastructure built to raising armies and raising funds for crusades. And several popes said, we have pagans still in Europe. Let's go skewer some of those pagans in Europe. So you had these Baltic crusades. Interestingly enough, Henry IV, King of England, he had sort of a crusading gap year. He's a bit infamous in Lithuania as having burnt Vilnius. So don't mention Henry IV, which is embarrassing for my wife, who is a descendant of Henry IV. So don't mention that here. This is not the city to do that. But you have a largely Germanic influence on Estonia and Latvia. I mean, what that meant is when the Protestant Reformation comes, they become largely Lutheran. Lutheranism swept through Lithuania, but then almost immediately a counter-Reformation by Jesuits sweeps through and they become re-Catholicized. So what you have is you have different countries with different cultural backstories. And I'll be happy to take questions later on that. I am working on a longer presentation on the whole history of the Baltic states because I'm doing a one-day course on it in March at Gladstone's library if anybody's really interested and dedicated enough to go to North Wales on a Saturday. But what happened? Well, one thing happened was, I'm going to go back a little bit. By 1795, all of this had disappeared off the map and had been subsumed into the Tsarist Empire. The Tsars of Russia had at various points taken over basically everything in Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and Finland. Had taken it off of Poland. Poland itself was dismembered and went off the map. Lithuania, as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was salami sliced several times and then ended up in 1795 fully in the last partition of Poland. Estonia and Latvia had been taken won in warfare off of the Swedes. Same thing with Finland. So these places all disappeared off the map, but then got back on the map after the First World War. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania all achieved independence in the Treaty of Versailles on paper. They achieved independence in practical matters as a matter of basically fighting their own wars of independence, which are effectively a backstory running in the midst of two Russian revolutions that went on in 1917, 1918. The period of time is extremely complex. All three of them fought against Bolshevik Red Army attempts to basically keep them as part of a Russian-Soviet polity. But they achieved their independence. All three of them had quite optimistic democratic constitutions. One could argue that they had a surfeit of democracy. There were huge numbers of political parties, particularly in Latvia and Estonia, which led to nobody having clear-cut majorities, lots of fragile coalitions, lots of shifts in power, and this is at a point where these countries have to be building their economies. These are still quite poor places. So what you get in the 1920s and 1930s is eventually the same thing that was happening across pretty much most of Central and Eastern Europe was a backsliding into authoritarianism. And so what you had, and by 1939, you can't classify any of these Baltic states as democratic societies. You can't characterize them as fascist dictatorships either. They were largely one-party rule, but by largely one-man rule by their individual dictators, Antanas Smetona in Lithuania, Ulmanis in Latvia, and Konstantin Pats in Estonia. None of them were fascists. They didn't have this sort of fascist ideology behind them. In fact, all three of them considered themselves Democrats, trying to safeguard the country until they could sort of transition it back to more democratic stuff. They all considered the actual fascist movements, which did exist in all three, to be rather dangerous, far more dangerous than communists. Communism didn't have much sway in the 20s and 30s in these countries. You could fit the entire Lithuanian, Communist Party in 1928 basically into a bus. But what happens in 1939? You have this, the Second World War breaks out. And the most immediate proximal cause of the Second World War breaking out, exactly when it did, is this nefarious treaty between Hitler and Stalin, the so-called Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, whereby they have a non-aggression pact, which is, of course, a treaty of really sort of convenience between the two. But there's a lot of subsidiary agreements to this. There's a lot of economic and military cooperation. This wasn't just each one trying to cheat the other. It really was a proper alliance in a lot of ways. And more importantly, there's a protocol to this. One of the appendices to this treaty on August 23rd, 1939, is a partition of Eastern Europe. Now, this goes against all the tenets of international law. Generally speaking, international law, you can't apply a treaty to a country that hasn't signed it. And that's just a fundamental basis of international jurisprudence. Well, Hitler and Stalin applied a treaty to Poland, Romania, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Finland, and basically partitioned and came up with this idea to divide up Eastern Europe. 8 days after they signed this treaty, Hitler invades Poland. 17 days later, Stalin invades Poland from the east. A Second World War is fully on the go. And what you get is, this is more or less the dividing, this is what was agreed as the dividing line. Also, Finland was written over to Soviet occupation as well. Now, these countries don't know this is going on. I mean, Poland knows it because it's happening in real time, all right? And Poland is being invaded from both ends. The West is very confused by this. And it's sort of a Western fallacy that we have that, the Soviet Union was always our ally. It wasn't. For the first 662 days of the Second World War in Europe, the Soviet Union was on the other side, okay? They were, and it wasn't just them just happening to be that way. They were actively helping the Germans. U-boats were based in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union is providing literally the explosives and aviation fuel for the Blitz. So it's a quite active collaboration. Now, the Baltic states think that, rather optimistically, that if they behave themselves, keep quiet, they're going to end up like, I don't know, Sweden, ride this thing out as neutral countries. That doesn't really last because Stalin puts the screws to the three countries and really in a variety of mechanisms. First in 1939, forcing military base agreements. So Soviet troops are actually quartered in these three countries, okay, under specific treaties and rules and procedures. But all of a sudden, there are more Soviet troops in these countries now than their local militaries are. Their local economies are not very good, so it's not like they can really even afford to build up much of a military defense. And so when, in June 1940, various ultimatums get issued to the Baltic states. And the Baltic states are in no position to physically resist anymore because there's literally, tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers garrisoned in each of these countries. And it all happens very quickly. And it happens at an exact point where the rest of the world is very, very distracted. What's going on in the rest of the world in June 1940? Dunkirk. Hitler is promenading down the Champs-Élysées. So if you were knocked on the head in a car accident in Vilnius in the end of May 1940 and woke up a month later, you woke up in a different world entirely. And so, with a stroke of a pen, they lose their independence. I'm going to actually come back to this slide. So what happens is in 1940, you get a very, very brutal occupation. And so you get what we have is basically, we talk about the occupation of the Baltic states. There's actually 3 periods of occupation. And you have effectively a Nazi occupation that was sandwiched between 2 very harsh Soviet occupations. And I'm going to talk through this whole period quite in some detail here because I try to unpack this a bit in the book and explain why people behaved the way they did. And so what happened in 1940 is elections were forced. New elections were forced. And these new elections were very, very rigged. They rigged it so that it was largely one candidate per constituency. The Soviet Union, the Soviet authorities, who, by this way, still weren't officially the occupiers yet, pushed through these elections very, very, very quickly, using every dirty election tactic on the books. Old versions of the electoral roll, ballots were registration documents for anybody who wasn't their candidate got lost, things like that. There was suspiciously high turnout. There was some constituencies where it was 120% turnout, so it was highly democratic, obviously. And so people's governments is what they were called. People's governments were elected in all 3 of these countries. And these governments basically met once. They met once and they voted to ask to be annexed to the Soviet Union. That's what happened. Okay. Now, people didn't like this, okay? This is not, Soviet historiography tries to write this out as a popular revolution. There wasn't a revolution. There wasn't a popular upswelling of pro-communist, workers and peasants, desire to join the fraternity of nations that is the Soviet Union. No, it was well, the Germans have a perfectly good word for this. It was an Anschluss. not dissimilar to what happened in, Austria. And so there were a lot, although the background here is that there's a lot of fertile ground for resistance to come up. All right. And so, I mean, the first great question is, eventually armed resistance does happen. It doesn't happen right away, but why? What are the conditions that made it possible for resistance to happen? What made it a good place for resistance to happen? Well, again, there's this national identity and language, and people are relatively fresh and new in that. In 1940, textbooks in Estonian had only been really published for about 20 years. You really only have one generation of people who grew up as Estonians as opposed to fairly oppressed residents of the Russian Empire. So you have 20 years of nationalism and national and patriotic identity, and all three of those countries had been run by, authoritarians who were really trying to appeal to national identity. But also you get a historical dislike of the Russian occupier. This goes back all the way back to the 1600s, 1700s. In these countries, Moscow, Muscovy is an ancient enemy. Okay, and in 1940, you had a lot of people still alive that remembered the Tsarist era and didn't remember it very fondly in many cases. As a practical matter, there's lots of forests and swamps, and it's good and quite dense forests and quite impenetrable swamps. These make good places to hide. Lots of smallholder farms, more so in Lithuania than in Latvia and Estonia. But in all three countries, land reform had broken up old Tsarist era estates, and so there were a lot of smallholder peasants. A dispersed smallholder farm economy can easily support partisan resistance because fighters have to eat. Lots of military veterans. A lot of people who are veterans of the First World War. All three of the countries had conscription at various points during their period of independence. Their militaries weren't very large in 1940, but an awful lot of people had sort of rotated through military service. All three countries had strong paramilitary reservist type movements. In Lithuania, it was the Riflemen's Union. There was an organization called the Kaitsalit, which sort of means Self-Defense League in Estonia, and the Aizargi, which really means the Guards. All three of these were government-sanctioned, quasi-governmental paramilitary movements that were meant to be an auxiliary wing of a home guard, if you will. The scouting movement was quite active, and the scouting movement ends up being well represented in the resistance later on, out of the basic principle that these are still rural economies, and the scouting movement teaches you how to live in the woods, and these are groups that end up living in the woods, and particularly in Lithuania and a little bit of a sort of a southeast corner of Latvia, the Catholic Church plays a role in the resistance too, because it has a hierarchical parish structure, and a very, very, very philosophically anti-communist philosophy that has been anti-communist as long as communism has been around, and contacts to overseas, contacts to a broader church hierarchy outside the country, and so that played a role. Now, in 1940, 1941, the initial shock and surprise of this didn't really allow for much resistance to happen right away. There was rapid oppression. By 1940, the Soviet secret police knew how to do oppression, okay? They knew how to run an Anschluss like this. They'd done it in other places. In 1940, they were fresh off of doing this to eastern Poland, and the area that they call Bessarabia, that we now call Moldova. They rapidly, effectively hijacked the three existing Baltic militaries. They did what they could to disarm all of those paramilitary groups. One thing, there was a rapid Sovietization of the economy, dispossession of large and medium-sized enterprises, collectivization of agriculture started but didn't get very far because it would take years to do that. But one of the things that didn't happen really was preparation for an invasion by the Germans. The Soviet historiography, would tell you that the Hitler-Molotov the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was really Stalin buying time to prepare for war with Germany. Well, in actual practical terms, he wasn't doing a lot to prepare for war with Germany. And so there was not a lot of military preparation for an invasion. Not only that, we have this exact timing becomes important in some of these things. You get this 1941 wave of deportations. There is this plan basically to either arrest or deport. Now, in Soviet terminology, when we say deport, we're not saying just chucked out of the country. We're saying internal exile, effectively, to places like Kazakhstan and Siberia. There was a plan to basically either formally arrest and charge, or just administratively exile and deport 10% of the population. Okay, so we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. And this wave of deportation started literally about 10 days before the German invasion. Of course, nobody knew that at the time except the Germans. So what you get is this German invasion happens in the end of June 1941 as literally train carriages of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians are being taken to Siberia, many of whom will never come back. Now, as a fundamental irony of all this, there's a lot of ironies and weird coincidences and things built in this story. I mean, one of the ironies is those deportations in 1941 saved Jewish culture, because there were enough Latvian, Estonian, Lithuanian Jews who were being deported to Siberia that they survived in Siberia and in the north of Russia to come back and provide a little bit of a fragment after the Holocaust. I will talk about the Holocaust, by the way. But that's one of the ironies of all this. Another irony is the Soviet partition of Eastern Europe is what gave Vilnius to the Lithuanians, because Vilnius had been occupied by the Poles. So we have this odd irony in that. Resistance during this particular period was very fragmented and very amateurish. It was things like student groups, not meeting terribly clandestinely, issuing student newspapers, things like that, very easily found and arrested and locked up. And there were numerous movements to try to develop a nucleus of resistance, because rather a lot of people felt that the contradictions between fascist Nazi ideology and Soviet communism were going to eventually end up in a war. I don't think anybody really realized how quickly that was going to happen. But there were plans for uprisings in the event. And in particular, the Lithuanians were ready to go with an uprising. There was this group called the Lithuanian Activist Front, the LAF. It was, and this is one of your sort of embarrassing points, although a nuanced embarrassing point, it was helped along by German intelligence, because the Germans, saw this movement. There was a guy named Kazys Škirpa who had been a Lithuanian diplomat in Berlin, sort of at loose ends now that Lithuania is occupied. He starts sort of gathering up Lithuanian exiles in his apartment in Berlin. Of course, it's a police state, so the Gestapo and the SS and the German intelligence all know this is going on. And he's cooperating with German intelligence. Now, he's actually cooperating with the Abwehr, which is the military intelligence service, at exactly the point that the Abwehr is starting to plot against Hitler. Right? So this is a funny nuance. Is he cool? So, where do you go with this from a historical perspective? But regardless of that, there are a bunch of uprisings in 1941. I think I have a slide about that. Yeah. Before sun sets on the first day of the invasion, Kaunas in Lithuania is up in arms, literally. This Lithuanian activist front has come out of the woodwork, has seized control of Kaunas, is liberating prisoners out of the KGB, has taken control of the radio station, and is declaring a provisional government. Uprisings take a little bit longer to come up in Latvia and Estonia, but they do happen, more scattershot. And there's these attempts to try to present the Germans with a fait accompli. All right, fine, we've got our country back, move on, go fight the Russians, we're okay here. That turned out to be rather idealistic. the German manipulation of these groups was really just meant to be an annoyance to the Soviets. There was not a German plan that allowed for reestablishment of Baltic independence. And so by the time the German army turns up in Kaunas a few days later, it pretty much says, no, guys, this is, no, thanks for your help, but no, you're disbanded. There are some troublesome incidents. One of the particularly bad wave of anti-Jewish violence happens here, because then we're going to get into the whole subject of the Holocaust, because, and I forget the guy's name. I name some names in the book. A SS guy turns up in Lithuania and basically starts to preach, anti-Semitic bilge to these rebels who rose up, and gets together basically a brute squad of them and starts massacring Jews. And this becomes a sort of dark spot in the Lithuanian resistance. So this 1941 uprising, because some elements of it did engage in pogroms and burnt a synagogue and then shot a bunch of people, it's kind of a dark chapter. Some people will take that dark chapter and try to apply it to the whole movement. Lithuanians in exile in the 1950s sort of tried to do the other thing, sort of not write about that at all, pretend it didn't happen. And these sort of arguments get still debated today. A huge question, every time a partisan is commemorated in Lithuania in particular, the question is, well, exactly what was he doing in 1941? Okay, and that does come up, and there are vicious arguments, and so much so that there has to be a lot of introspection on this, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. So you get this whole Nazi occupation. The initial optimism was dashed. Okay, there's this idea that that the arriving Germans were greeted with buckets of milk and and honey and bread and salt and all that. There are instances of that happening. I've got several things to say for that. First of all, the German invasion disrupted the planned deportation of 10% of the population. So the Soviet oppression was halted, okay? And so people are obviously relieved about that. And the other thing is, a lot of people remember, everybody above a certain age remembered the First World War. All three of these countries were under German occupation at various points in the First World War under the Kaiser. And actually, they viewed that as a good thing. All three of the countries managed to achieve some degree of self-rule and get their act together so that they had an ability to really declare their independence in 1918. And that happened because of German occupation, okay? So you can't fault somebody for thinking, well, it's 1915 again. Okay, that wasn't so bad. They threw the Russians out last time, and we actually made good out of it. But those hopes were quickly dashed. The whole area that is now Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia was the German province of Ostland. It was meant to be a zone of economic exploitation and a source of labor. It was meant to be a source of food because this is a largely agrarian place, a source of natural resources, particularly oil shale in Estonia, timber in Latvia and Lithuania, food from all three. There wasn't the equivalent of a Vichy government or like that. There was local administration that were effectively collaborators, but there wasn't national regimes that were at least nominally in paper independent. It wasn't like Croatia or Slovakia, for example. I guess say collaboration. I'm gonna talk about collaboration in a little bit more depth because it runs both ways. Because you have basically countries that are stuck between two large warring countries, both of which have occupied the place. You have this mess of people who are effectively collaborating with either or both sides during the period of this conflict. Much of it conscripted. And I want to talk about that. The Holocaust. I have a whole slide on the Holocaust next. But also you have this rise of, because of the Holocaust, you have a rise of some Jewish resistance movements. are quite sizable, particularly in Vilnius and Kaunas. And so any story of this particular period of time has to talk about Jewish partisan groups too. There's an excellent book from the 1970s on it that's mentioned in my book. I talk a little bit about it in there. Very much a thing in Lithuania, not so much in Latvia, and not at all in Estonia. The pre-war Jewish population in Estonia was probably only big enough to fit in this college. And various resistance starts to form. That 1941 resistance that had that rebellion, roughly half of them fade away into the woods. The other half get sort of co-opted by the Germans into various battalions, police units, in some cases even SS legions, of which desertion is rife. So you get this mix of it. So the Germans try to create military forces in these places. A SS legion was recruited in Latvia, and another one was recruited in Estonia. They weren't called that at first. They were just called, literally that. The Latvian legion, Estonian legion, they got retrofitted. Oh, you're in the SS now. Like, okay. The Lithuanians managed to boycott an SS legion. There was a quite detailed effort to do that. And what you get during this World War II period of occupation is 1941, people think, well, these Germans have done it. They're going to defeat the Soviets. We better figure out what we're going to do. 1942, the war could go either way. By 1943, even sort of the thickest of the thick start to say, this is not going the way the Germans wanted to go. And so the formation of resistance units is largely plotting for a Soviet return. So, this war is going to be over, the Soviets are going to come back, and that's when we're going to have to really carry the fight on. So there's a lot of that. There are what we call Soviet or Red Partisan units active, much more so in other parts of the Soviet Union. Not so much. These are actual, communist units. The nucleus of the origin of them was fragments of Red Army units who were left behind in the retreat and coalesced into resistance units, followed up by infiltrators from over the lines from Moscow. They didn't get much purchase really in the Baltic states, but it's important to mention that they do happen. They figure more prominently in the written record than the actual record, if you see what I mean, because history was written by the victors. And you sort of have to raise the question, is this a three-way conflict? And it kind of is. This whole idea that the Second World War is just a binary conflict with good guys and bad guys, it gets kind of messy. It gets messy in other parts of the world too. It gets really messy in China. I mean, you could argue that the Second World War in China was about a five-way conflict. The Holocaust. You don't read anything about the Holocaust in some of the Soviet books. Some of the Soviet books in there are sort of just talk about the murder of Soviet citizens. But what you had was a complete destruction of Jewish life because of the way that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania evolved in the Middle Ages. It was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious polity, and it had freedom of religion. And so a lot of Jewish people in the Middle Ages settled in what was now called the Pale of Settlement, and a lot of that, and sort of the north end of that, the very, very north end of this old Pale of Jewish settlement was in Lithuania and a tiny sort of southeastern corner of Latvia. And what you get is a very rapid eradication of this. Now, and if you start looking through the statistics of what happened in the Baltic states in the war and the Holocaust, you get this odd phenomena that actually more Jews died in the Holocaust in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia than lived there before the war, because actually a number of camps were set up, and Jews from elsewhere were also brought in and murdered or worked to death as well too. Vilnius had been a great center of Jewish learning. Had at one point, sort of a third of the population of it was Jewish, possibly more, depending on which census you look at. That's all gone. Lots of synagogues went. A true eradication of Jewish culture. There had not been much of a Jewish community in Estonia for historic reasons, but it was almost all gone. I should also mention that nobody talks about the Romani, the Gypsies. Their eradication was even more total in the Baltic states than that of Judaism. And it's something we don't talk about so much, but it's very much a thing. I mean, you won't find a Lithuanian Roma anymore. That just excised off the map, and that's a sad thing too. And there was collaboration with the local people. You don't achieve this sort of genocide without collaboration. And the Germans were very good propagandists. They weaponized existing anti-Semitic feelings, also did a lot to conflate Judaism with communism. Didn't help that they could point to certain officials of the Soviet Union who were Jewish, including in the secret police. And so, yeah. And this runs both ways, though, because there were tremendous efforts to actually help save Jews. In Latvia and Lithuania in particular, lots of people really, many people lost their lives saving Jews, and a lot of people barely survived imprisonment because of it. And thousands of Jews were actually saved because of the efforts of very, very brave people. And so it's a mixed legacy, and it's a mixed legacy because I had to develop this sort of spectrum of collaboration. Is it collaboration? Is it cooperation, coercion, co-option? And so if somebody did something to help the Germans, well, what is it they did, and how did they come to it? So, and I submit to you that there's a mix of things. If somebody was literally dragged off the street and conscripted and taken to Germany and put to work in an ammunition factory, they're helping the German war effort, but we're not calling them a collaborator. Okay, so the spectrum starts there. And if somebody joins the SS Legion and immediately deserts after his first paycheck with 6 hand grenades, a rifle, and 400 rounds of ammunition, and a wool coat, because that did happen, that's not collaboration. That's in fact, that's sort of the opposite of collaboration. That's sabotaging the war effort, and that happened. Rather, a lot of these military units were sort of 80% conscript. So people who were conscripted and coerced into service. And some of this conscription was, well, theoretically voluntary enlistment, but it was enlistment with harsh options: enlist or we lock your family up, enlist or you could go work in slave conditions in Germany. So, gee, I'm going to take the paid job where I have a chance, or the unpaid job behind the wire. It's not much of a choice for some people. We also sometimes forget how effective Nazi propaganda was, particularly when, sort of, if you're trying to say bad things about the Soviet Union in 1942 in the Baltic states, you're kind of pushing on an open door. It's like, you've got unfinished business, boy. Why don't you take a rifle? We'd go kill some Russians. That's the sort of thing, appeal that would, if you'd lost family in that deportation effort, you might see joining the German army as a way to maybe get your family back. So I'm not saying that this is right. There's a mix of right and wrong here, and there's a mix of people in impossible positions having to make impossible choices. So a common trope about the Baltic states is, oh, they're all German collaborators. But I also say, you get voluntary enlistment due to opportunism. Wars flush out the opportunists. I'm sure we're seeing that right now in Gaza and Israel. We're seeing it in Ukraine. Every war flushes out an opportunist, the soldier of fortune, the adventure junkie, the guy who doesn't want to sit on the farm picking potatoes, would rather go out and do something interesting. And then, yeah, we really do have fascists. All right? There really are people with far-right views who are, if not Nazi, sort of Nazi adjacent. It's funny that the Germans really didn't trust them very much. They viewed them as sort of almost like some sort of deviants, like, you guys don't really, you guys must be thick. We're gonna get rid of you guys. Surely you know that, right? And so the German war effort was a convenient use of employment for people. I also say you throw the spectrum around. If it's July 1941 and it's the Soviets retreating from Estonia, it's the same thing. There is collaboration with the Soviet authorities. And when the Soviet authorities come back in 1944 and 1945, there's absolutely everything. There's people getting locked up and sent to a factory. There's the opportunists who flip sides. There are people who say, oh shit, maybe if I join the Red Army, my village won't get destroyed. Conscription, because in 1944, when the Soviets come back, they view all these people as Soviet citizens. Guess what? You're behind on your military service. Off you go. Voluntary enlistment, opportunists, and 3 years of living under fascism might make somebody into a communist. So the paradigm works in both ways. And so when you start adding up the number of people who fought from the Baltic states who fought on each side, about roughly equivalent numbers of people fought for the Soviet Union or for the Soviets. And so what you get is you get a really, really mixed bag of legacies. And every single one of those people has got a different story to tell at a different angle. And so you can put another sort of axis on this chart, if you will. What did somebody do? All right. So you ended up joining the Germans. Well, the spectrum of what you got, the work you got put to do for the Germans ranged from, literally shooting Jewish people in an Einsatzgruppen, or locking up your neighbors, or running a prison camp, all the way down to some of these guys in SS units. They were traffic cops. They were literally traffic cops and fire brigades, and so most people were somewhere in the middle. The majority of these units were basically just cannon fodder for fighting conventional war on the front. And so you've got to take everybody who is anybody. You have to take, if somebody was involved in that war, you got to look at their story. And you got to say, what was their motive and what did they end up doing before you start to say, this guy was a Nazi, this guy was a communist. In fact, and the factor in all this, because in all of this stuff, desertion is rampant. There are people that flip sides. There are people that join up and quit and join up again and quit. And so you get a huge mess trying to figure this out retrospectively. So the Soviets come back. The Soviets come back not all at once. It's a gradual movement of the front. And partisan warfare starts in earnest. And I say gradual movement of the front. In Estonia, the Germans basically bug out, leaving sort of Estonians to fend for themselves. But the Soviets aren't really ready to take advantage of that. So there's about a 6-week period of time where the Estonians are really trying to run their own affairs. And it's a huge window for people to leave over the water to Finland or Sweden. And so a lot of people flee. In Latvia, the advance of the Soviets moves very slowly from the west of Latvia to the east. The east of Latvia to the west. And by the end of the war, Western Latvia is still in German hands, and the German army is there, trapped, starving, surrounded, and gives up. In Lithuania, you get formations of, you get large battles, actually. Well, not large battles by World War II standards, but large battles by the standard of partisan conflict as the Soviets turn up. You get company-sized units of 100, 120 people fighting large amounts of Soviets, usually getting massacred. And so you get this, you get these very, very quick switch in partisan tactics from larger units to small units, because several things happen. First of all, people realize that this war is going to drag on. There was an understanding from other people that, that the war was just going to go into a different phase. That clearly the Russians were just going to end up fighting the Americans and the British, and there was going to be, this war was just going to go on. And so we have to be the sort of democratic resistance for when the Americans and the British turn up. Well, that never happened, okay? And so the first winter, 1945 and 1946, people are getting awfully hungry because it's hard to feed 120 people in a swamp. But it's not hard to feed 10 or 15 people scattered around with access to small farms. So you get a very fractal resistance movement in all three. And the post-war insurgency drags on for a lot of time. This, basically what you see from 1945 to about 1955, about a 10-year period of time, there is a partisan resistance in all three countries. And you get, well, I'll talk through it here. In Estonia, well, if you look at Estonia, the peak was about 14 to 15,000 active partisans. That's significant because it's 1% of the population at the time. 1%. That's 1 person in 100 is part of this movement. The peak was in about 1947. They finally gradually formed a national movement, the RVL, but by the time they formed the RVL, it was, and got really organized, it was a bit late. It was 48, 49, 50, and they were really, really behind. Latvia never really emerged as a national organization, which is confusing looking at all these groups. It's, forgive the Monty Python joke, it was a little bit People's Front of Judea. But there's all these different national fronts and national union and national this, and none of them were national. Okay, the Latvian resistance had suffered some early setbacks and never really organized. The Lithuanians had a series of 3 national organizations, and were larger. Now, again, that 30,000 fighters is again about 1% of the population. And so they had de facto control of much of rural Lithuania, at least by night, until 1948, 1949. And so this is, it becomes a classic insurgency in that there are denied areas. There are areas where the Soviet state cannot operate, or can only operate in large number. And there is a national movement. The national movement was repeatedly infiltrated by KGB spies. So that's why you have a series of 3 different movements. The first one got quite heavily infiltrated, so it had to reorganize. Same thing with the second one. And then the third one really did organize and had provincial and district command structure, cells. It had a cell structure leading to basically every part of the country. The last of these groups really kind of were busted up by about 1956. I mean, by 1952, we're talking hundreds of people, not thousands. So, yeah, it's hard to gauge the numbers. I do make an attempt in the book. And there's a really good book called The Soviet Counterinsurgency in the Western Borderlands that does a good job of trying to track the numbers on this. Partisan tactics. It's interesting. There's a great scholar, the great British scholar of Lithuanian stuff, Francis Young. I don't know if anybody know him. Sort of says that the partisans were, armed publishers, because particularly in Lithuania, the idea is, I am running short on time. I'm sorry. Running newspapers, okay. This is not the Viet Cong, okay? This is not a partisan band. This is a low-intensity conflict. A partisan band is basically trying to survive, trying to make its existence known, and trying to do things like survive and stay off the grid and stay out of control of the Soviet Union. So a lot of the activity is trying to protect farmers, trying to conduct reprisals against particularly notorious Soviet secret police officials, deny labor to Red Army and industry, and help prepare for World War III, which unfortunately never happens. Lots of construction of underground bunkers. That's how you keep your movement alive against an enemy that has air cover. who can fly over and see where you are. So extensive networks of underground bunkers all over all three Baltic states. There is some interaction with the West. Another occasional trope is that this whole thing was just a front from MI6 and the CIA. No, it was a pre-existing phenomena, but of course, in this early Cold War era, the intelligence services in the West, and I should say also in Sweden and Finland, who are very interested in what's going on in their near abroad, try to effect a liaison with these units. Not so much to keep the insurgency going. They view these organizations as a good conduit for information. Obviously, eyes behind the Iron Curtain are good if you want to see if there's a Soviet mobilization, that if World War III is coming, So there wasn't a lot of support in terms of, arms and materiel. It was really agents and radio sets to try to stay in touch with these guys. I'd say because of a guy named Kim Philby, associated with this university, I should say, part of the Cambridge Five. Kim Philby was very involved in the British part of this operation and sort of betrayed the whole thing. John Harvey Jones, though, did a lot of work, late of ICI Industry and what was that TV show, Troubleshooter? Yeah. No, his MBE was for something called the British Baltic Fisheries Protection Service, whereby he was running speedboats and infiltrating agents into the Baltic states. Alas, a lot of those agents were betrayed. Some of them indeed were double agents. A whole story there. The Soviets eventually crushed the life out of this. This was largely not a battle against the Red Army. The Soviets tried to keep the Red Army itself for warfighting. Also, the Red Army is a conscript outfit. Some of these guys who are conscripts in the Red Army might feel a little bit of sympathy with these Lithuanians. Some guy from Kazakhstan might say, hey, they're doing to these guys what it did to my family. So the primary combatants on the Soviet side were depending on the year, the NKVD, which then became the MGB, and then the KGB. They had internal troops that were organized and equipped just like the army. So also secret police and domestic intelligence collection, informants, secret agents, the classic, all your secret police stuff. Because the Baltic states do border on the west, or at least onto the Baltic, border troops are important. There's also these outfits called the instability. These were local auxiliaries. These were brute squads of, literally the dregs of society. Petty thieves, prisoners, criminals, opportunists, in some cases mental patients, were basically rounded up and given a choice, like you guys can go to Siberia or you can become the local brute squad, and and they have a bad reputation, these units, and some of the worst atrocities were these very ill-disciplined instability, which means sort of destroyer in Russian. The Red Army was brought in for really big operations or as a backstop, and then conventional policing plays a role in this. And I am almost done. The Soviets win. There's attrition. They win the war of attrition. Dead partisans can barely replace themselves, but there's a practically infinite supply of Soviet manpower. These are small countries in a large, incorporated into a bigger country. All the classic counterintelligence and counterinsurgency tools are put to work: arrest, torture, infiltration, betrayal. Also, conscription into the Red Army just denies these guys of manpower. Deportation, somebody who's banged up in a camp in Vorkuta can't be a partisan, or so you think. Also, in a lot of cases, just omnipresence. There were situations where there was a 30-to-1 ratio between Soviet garrisons and partisans. And so if you can achieve and maintain that overwhelming ratio against an insurgency, you tend to win. And that's one of the reasons why the French never won in Algeria, the America never won in Vietnam. You can't, those countries couldn't maintain that sort of ratio. Also, I should say amnesties. The KGB more or less honored its amnesties. They viewed amnesties as a valid tool. In fact, they were more worried about petty criminals faking themselves to be partisans, so they would interrogate you quite severely to make sure you really were a partisan before they gave you an amnesty. And sometimes the amnesties got reneged on, but actually there's disciplinary records in the Soviet Union of local commanders who were actually harshly disciplined because they went back on an amnesty. So the amnesties are a valid counterinsurgency tactic. The death of Stalin took some of the impetus out of this, the eventual lack of a World War III. The partisans who were still around listening to the shortwave radios were really excited when the Korean War happened, figuring it was all going to kick off. No. And the biggest thing, the collectivization of food supply, taking the smallholder farms and collectivizing them into state farms and collective farms cut off the food supply. So instead of farmers voluntarily helping out the partisans, you had to engage in stealth and deception to steal the food, and that was much harder. And that really took the wind out of it. A lot of partisans end up in the Gulag. They ended up instrumental in Gulag uprisings. All right, so you could argue that the great Gulag uprisings, many of whom you've never heard of, in places like Vorkuta, Norilsk, and Kengir in sort of 1953, 1954. Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, I should also say Ukrainians and Poles as well, played a very large role in these uprisings. These uprisings themselves had a tremendous effect in the years after the end of Stalin in actually liberalizing the regime in the prison system in the Soviet Union. So there's some impact there. And again, I'm almost at the, I've exceeded my remit here. But did it matter? And I'd say it did matter because for a period of time, it delayed the collectivization of agriculture. By delaying the collectivization of agriculture and controlling the rural areas for a while, it reduced the ability of the Soviet Union to change the demographics and import a lot of non-Baltic ethnic population into the area. And so it's one of the reasons, the partisan resistance is the reason why Lithuania is still 80% Lithuanian. And the slightly diminished resistance and also the somewhat more urbanized and industrialized population in Estonia and Latvia is one of the reasons why in those countries more ethnic Russians were brought in, because it was easier to bring them into city areas as opposed to rural areas. The partisan units, particularly in Latvia and Estonia, allowed people to leave. It gave a window of time for people to leave and allowed a diaspora in the West to keep fragile, small cultures alive. It tied down significant amounts of resources during the early Cold War, saved some lives. Some really, really, really bad people who were going to kill lots of Lithuanians ended up at the end of a rope or on the receiving end of a bullet. It reduced the available manpower for conscription into the Soviet army and delayed some of the harshest Russification efforts until after the death of Stalin, when there wasn't the willpower to do it. And as I said, exported experience and combat experience into the Gulag system where it became useful in uprisings. And finally, it gave a symbol. The Forest Brothers, and they were all three of these countries, they were called the Forest Brothers, hence the name of my book, The Forest Brotherhood. It gave powerful symbols to these countries, and powerful symbols to this day. The main characters in these movements are national heroes. They are household names. And so it's part of national identity. And so symbols are important when you're trying to reestablish your nationhood, which is what happened in the 1980s. 1980s, you got independence movements again. In the 1980s, a lot of these former partisans are still alive. And then you get glasnost and perestroika, and people can start to tell their stories again. They weren't allowed to until that point. So it matters. I mean, I'd say we have this Center for Baltic Geopolitics here, and the Baltic states are a thing, and they are a thing largely because, well, not entirely, but the partisan movements and these resistance movements, and I should just throw a lot of credit to the nonviolent resistance movements too that existed well after the end of the partisan resistance. Resistance kept the idea of Lithuania, idea of Estonia, idea of Latvia alive. And so that's why it's important. On that note, I will take questions or discussion or comments or complaints or, you know, I'm near enough to the window, so I don't think I could fall out of any of these windows. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan, for such a fascinating and, I must say, comprehensive treatment of this difficult subject. I'm sure we'll get loads of questions, but I'll abuse my position as a chair and ask the first two ones, I guess. I'll start with the easier one.
Okay.
Dan, you're a true man of Renaissance. I mean, when I look at your biography, you started as a student in political science and Russian language in Texas. Then you were commissioned as an officer in the U.S. Army Chemical Corps. Then you did extensive training in U.S. Army Chemical School. Then you worked as a disaster preparedness advisor at the White House Military Office, where you had responsibility for training the office of the president. I suppose that was Clinton. Then U.S. Secret Service, where you worked at the team protecting Clinton and the White House from chemical and biological threats. And your last book before this one was actually called Toxic, A History of Nerve Agents.
And it's for sale in the back, too.
Oh, really?
Yes.
So my question is, this is like James Bond material. And how did this all experience and expertise help you navigate this particular subject, in particular in terms of selection of sources, treatment of sources, and perhaps connections who led you to some of the sources, or just general outlook?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I've had a broad and diverse career where I've had spend much of my time explaining complicated things to an audience that didn't get it. Nobody cares about chemical weapons until they do. And so I don't know how to answer your question. I really don't. I've done a lot of interesting things, but the things that sound the most interesting there are probably the most boring in real life terms. Say, oh yes, you work for the Secret Service. Yeah, I spent a lot of time doing 12-hour shifts in the back of a van. And you end up spend an awful lot of time in airport lounges, and so you spend an awful lot of time reading. So I read everything I could find on the Baltics because I was interested. And my first time I visited Lithuania was in 2002 with George Bush. It's the only time in my life I could ever play the race card and say, "You got to send me on this trip, boss. I'm your guy. I know 12 words of Lithuanian." So, it all helped, I guess.
So it's not like it's on TV, I guess.
No,
okay.
No. It's terribly dull.
My second question is a bit more difficult. The history of this whole resistance is, I think, a history of moral dilemmas.
Yes.
And this is a very painful and charged subject from all the sides.
Yeah.
And I just want to start with the two sort of examples from real life. The first, I've learned about it in the sources, and the second, I've learned about it from my grandfather, who was there at the time. The first one is a 16-year-old girl who joins Komsomol, the communist youth, right? She never held a weapon in her arms.
Yeah.
She never betrayed anyone. And there come the Forest brothers at night and shoot her.
Yeah.
The second story, I mean, is it, the dilemma is this just? Is this heroic? Is this right? And is this something to, write home about? The second dilemma is which I've heard from my grandpa. I don't know how real is this, but he was pretty consistent in telling it. So I suppose there is at least a grain of truth in that. Basically, he had a neighbor or someone from the village who was harassing him. Right, the guy broke his windows. He was like threatening his wife and stuff like that, just out of control. And my grandpa was on good terms with the Forest brothers. So he went to the forest and he told them, these things are just not working between me and this guy. Can you, and they said, we'll be done. And that guy was shot in 2 weeks. And my grandpa was so proud of it. So again, the context of it is
Yeah.
passions running
Yeah.
high,
Oh, yeah.
the misery of the immediate post-World War II. Everyone is hungry, everyone is angry,
Yes.
everyone is insecure. And your book fundamentally is, it's critical, but it's a positive appraisal of all this. So my question finally is, what tipped the scales for you, in favor of a positive appraisal? What were those moments, and what were those moral dilemmas, perhaps, that you were having when doing this?
The biggest moment of moral clarity I had was when I discovered the deportation database in Lithuania, where rather painstakingly over the last 30 years, archivists in Lithuania have looked through old Soviet records and tried to document every single person who was arrested or executed or deported. Some people had all three. Some people got deported and came back and then were arrested and then shot. So some people, but there's a database. And I have a very exotic Lithuanian surname that's tied to a very specific village in the poorest bit of southern Lithuania. Okay? The village has never had more than 75 people. All right? And so my name ties me to a specific bit of very poor farmland. And so I stuck my surname in this database, and I found 87 people with my surname, either shot, only I think 2 of them were shot, the rest were either arrested or deported. The oldest, well into their 90s, the youngest, age 2. And this is practically my entire gene pool. I just sat there in the British Library where I had, and I just was stunned for an hour of that. And it's like, okay, so I said, well, let's look at some other families. So what you get is, if you were a Latvian or a Lithuanian or an Estonian, I submit to you right now, also, if you were, honestly, in Gaza or a Ukrainian in the eastern half of Ukraine, this is an existential crisis in a way that, Americans and British people aren't used to having, okay? Britain's not used to this because it's an island. It's got water in every direction, and it's not been invaded a lot. It's been invaded a bit, but it's been a while. And those invasions were changes in management. They weren't, existential threats to everybody. And so all of a sudden, I realized every family in Lithuania's got these stories, okay? And so when you got the Germans on one side and the Soviets on the other thing, unless you're lucky enough to live next to a guy with a boat and you can go to Sweden, and you might have a third way up, you've got a lot of choices. And these are, and the choices are a range of choices that none of them are good choices. And doing nothing is also a choice, but that's not necessarily the choice that's going to be the least bad of your choices. So, and you get these recriminations. You get, in my grandmother's family, a bit of the family that stayed back, there was a guy who ended up as a policeman in the Soviet Union. He was a traffic cop working for the GII, which was the traffic police in Soviet Lithuania. Died before independence, well before independence, because he died age 57 of lung cancer because this Soviet cigarettes got to him. But he was never mentioned because he was considered a traitor, But I say, he's a guy who made a decision, There's one guy in the family I can point to who probably was a Nazi collaborator, but I got another ancestor who was Jewish. It was massacred by the Einsatztruppe, and so everybody's got these messed up family backstories. I'm sure you do. You just touched on just a little bit of it. I'm sure if you talk to everybody you know, it's a real mess, and so when you have a polarizing mess like that, things come out of it. And one of the things that came out of it is this forced brotherhood movement with all its warts and good and bad and everything. So, and it's a thing that people in the West don't know much about. And I just felt that it's a story that needs to be told. I don't know what it is.
Thank you.
Okay.
Let's open up
Oh,
the floor for
yes.
questions.
I was just wondering how an amateur historian could research this themselves online, and to what extent is Russia controlling the archive?
Ah, okay. That's a good question. That's a very good question. And the answer is, it's easier in Lithuania than in Latvia and Estonia for the precise purpose that rather more KGB documentation got captured intact in 1990, 1991 when these countries, although the situation is not bad in Estonia and Latvia. But also there was this golden era in the early 1990s where Western historians could go and look in the Russian archives. The Yeltsin years weren't bad for that. So there's a lot of interesting books written by that. It's hard to go back and do the primary research on that stuff now, but there's a lot of secondary stuff that had a good glimpse into that. Okay? And some of that stuff is in libraries and all that. You're up against a language barrier in a lot of cases. I'd also say the online translation stuff is much easier now than even it was a year or two ago. There are computer programs where you can shove a PDF in Estonian in and get a reasonable facsimile out of it in English. And it's not bad and getting better by the day. We also, don't forget, I mean, the Estonians invented Skype. It's a techie place. I mean, and these are three countries that realize that their languages are not very accessible to foreigners. So there are a lot of tools out there. The problem I had, I had too much Lithuanian stuff and not enough Latvian and Estonian stuff. And I still feel a little bit guilty about giving some short shrift to the Latvians and Estonians. Some of that was a language barrier, there was a contact barrier, and a lot of it was just documentation barrier. Just some of that documentation isn't as online. I mean, the Lithuanians have done a very, very good job of shoving this stuff online. And they've done things like a lot of books that were written by former partisans and only written in Lithuanian are now out there as downloadable PDFs, for free on their archive site. And so you can access a lot more of this. The intelligence service stuff, the CIA dumped a lot of stuff on the Freedom of Information Act on their efforts to liaise with particularly with the Lithuanian underground. There was an informal division of labor in that the British were dealing with the Latvians and Estonians because they could get to them by sea. The Lithuanian coastline is quite small, so the Americans were using C-47 aircraft and parachutes. But the British documentation, very hard to get. The American stuff, I've got thousands of pages of it now. I've got a whole other book on that coming at some point, probably 5 years from now. So, I mean, there's... And the other thing is, because we're talking about stuff that happened in the 40s and 50s, a lot of these people were alive in the 1990s, and a lot of these people told their stories and got it written down. Now, a lot of that is in niche publications in Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian, but that stuff is there if you want to go dig for it.
Okay.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you. You touched upon it briefly, sorts of ties between the West and the Forest Brothers, but I was wondering if you could go into more detail concerning that. Was it like a sort of equivalent of Operation Gladio in preparation of any sort?
No, sort of a different beast than Operation Gladio, and by means of reference, Operation Gladio, which I'm not even sure if that was actually its name or one of a number of names for it, was plots by Western intelligence services in Western Europe to have sort of pre-baked resistance movements ready to go in case the Soviet Union occupied Western Europe. Now, because this was a different thing because there were already resistance groups on the go, as opposed to trying to set up one from scratch. And so the typical thing was basically trying to find Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians, usually in displaced persons camps, usually in West Germany, and recruit them and train them and infiltrate them back in. But there were also guys who got out usually through Sweden, and then made contact with the West, with Western intelligence services. And I should say the Swedish intelligence service, officially neutral in all this, was a very good sort of middleman in this. Sort of funneling guys to the right contacts. But both of those methods of operation were prone to infiltration. Some guy turns up literally on a boat in Sweden and says, "Hey, I just escaped from I just escaped from Latvia. I'm here from my band of brothers over here," and CIA or MI6 would lap that right up and give the guy 6 months of training and radio set and parachute him right back in, and he'd sort of betray the whole thing, and that happened a lot. It was largely meant for liaison and intelligence collection. In fact, I think the CIA was a little bit. The one great success was this guy, Joseph Lucia. He became quite a heroic leader of the resistance after he was already a heroic leader of the resistance. He got out, made contact first with French intelligence and then the CIA, got parachuted back in. He's the one great success story of the rest of it. The rest of it's all basically crap. Okay. And I think the CIA is, there's two interesting documents that are after action reports of how it went wrong and how he eventually got betrayed and all that. They were a bit stunned that it actually kind of worked because most of the rest of it hadn't worked. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I guess this may be beyond the scope of your book, but why do you think that Finland largely escaped from the kind of Soviet occupation that Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania experienced?
One guy, Marshall Mannerheim. I should say there's an excellent biography of Marshall Mannerheim out by my publisher. I'd say it's 80% him. But also, they fought hard and they had a bigger army. They actually fought as opposed to rolling over.
Could I just say, for information, that we had an excellent event actually in this very room with Henrik Meilander, the author of the book you're describing.
Yeah.
And you can find on our website the event where the author described the role of Mannerheim.
Yeah. Yes. So yes, I give a lot of credit to Mannerheim. Yes, sir. Oh.
Thank you. I'm still grappling in my mind as to whether these forest brothers are sort of romantic resistance heroes and freedom-loving partisans, or whether they're actually just a bunch of bandits and former Nazi collaborators. So I'm still not quite clear who they are and what they represent.
Okay. I'd say that maybe for my next time I do this slide, I could probably do a spectrum of the forest brother in the same way I did as a spectrum of the collaborator, because yes, you have former Nazi fighters in the movement. Not as many as necessarily are people led to believe, because rather a lot of them bugged out to the west. And by the time we get to the peak movement here, the age of the movement is such that, if you're 20 in 1950, you were too young to have been anything, and you were 11 in 1941. Okay. Some serious work on the actual demographics, who these people were, has been done in more detail in Lithuania than in Latvia and Estonia. The average forest brother was not a city dweller. Was usually came out of a town or countryside background. The average forest brother recruit was somebody evading Soviet conscription or evading the deportation of their farm. So it's a, oh shit, the Soviets are coming either to take me off to the army or they're going to take us all off to Siberia. I'm going to run off to the woods. So it's not necessarily an ideological decision, it's a survival decision. And so you get this cross-cut of rural population. Now, in that you get, but then you get, who are the leaders? The leaders tend to be school teachers and scout leaders, and not necessarily, there are some priests, but sort of parish committee members. I mean, the equivalent of church wardens. So you get this, you get some former military guys as leaders, not terribly senior ones. They had been sort of sergeants or lieutenants in the pre-war army. mostly because the more senior guys just didn't make it that far. They're already off of somebody else's camp. And you get unlikely heroes. You get scoundrels. When the organizations start to sort of solidify, you get this more in Estonia and Lithuania, as opposed to Latvia, where the movement is more fragmented. You start to get more rigid disciplinary structures, and the idea that, you know what, it's bad for the movement to have scoundrels. It's bad for the unit. So it's bad for us to have drunkards. So let's not. We're declaring our bunker an alcohol-free zone. It's the sort of thing, you know. I'm going to rat out my neighbor, and the partisans are going to kill him. In 1946, that was probably, I don't know if in 1946, that sort of thing was much more common then than it would have been about 1948, 1949, because all of a sudden there's rules, there's procedures. There's a disciplinary committee that will call you up for doing something like that, and you might, get thrown out of the movement, which is practically a death sentence, or at least a deportation sentence, So yeah, it's like any movement. It's a movement that its height is pulling in 1% of the population, so it's going to get a crosscut of everything. So all that stuff, the heroes are there if you want to find them, the villains are there if you want to find them, and I suspect that it's a normal distribution, And I think most of the people are in the middle. But also, the people in the middle are not well documented on this. The heroes and villains get written about. The guys who sit for 3 or 4 years in a bunker, and nobody writes about them very much, they don't get a look in the historiography of this. And it's one of the reasons that makes it actually quite hard to write about this from an encyclopedic or sort of chronological matter, because there's an awful lot of nothing going on. It's a bit like, the structure of an atom. An atom is mostly empty space. There's an awful lot of nothing happening, then something happens, and then nothing happening. This stuff moves at a glacial pace, and also it's very fragmented. So it's just like, yes, we know there were partisans there, and nobody knows what they did because they all died and nobody wrote about it. So there's a lot of unknown, and when there's a lot of unknown, you could project either the villain or the hero onto that unknown, and there's a lot of that goes on, depending on which sort of facet of the diamond you want to look at. If you look at 1950s, emigre literature in America, and some of it's awful. It's very much hagiography. The Lithuanians can do no wrong. Second World War, we're not even to talk about that. The story starts in 1945. Like, wait a minute, and there's an awful lot of laundering of bad history on that. But also, 1960s Soviet historiography is like, they're all bandits. And I kind of address both of these in the book. And in the case of the Soviets, they're all bandits thing. Well, by definition, if you weren't working for the Soviet state, you were illegal. So by definition, you were a bandit. So it's sort of it's a self-licking ice cream cone. It's a definition. Of course, by the standards of the Soviet state, they were bandits, because if you weren't in the system, you were a bandit. So, and I'd also say there's a lot of banditry on the Soviet side too. And throw it all in together, because this is a dirty war. There are outrages that appear to have been perpetrated by partisan units, but one of the Soviet tactics was to make fake partisan units, get some guys, and go burn a village and rape some women and steal some stuff, and therefore blaming it on the partisans, write it up as a partisan outrage and all that. So that sort of thing, if you want to use that as that can sort of poison the data pool, if you see what I mean. So it's a hard mess. It's a hot mess to deal with,
Thank you. I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we'll collect just 3 really short questions and 3 really short answers.
Thanks very much for the presentation. Very quick question. You sort of touched on the role of German propaganda in anti-Semitism in Lithuania. I wonder if you can briefly talk about pre-existing anti-Semitism and the role of the Catholic Church.
Let's collect the batch, and then anyone else who would like to ask a short. The lady at the back.
Okay.
Okay, let's start here.
Okay. Anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Thank you. You briefly mentioned in your presentation that the legacy of Forest Brotherhood was used in the democratic transition in the 90s. Can you please tell me more about how it was received among the population and how exactly it was used?
Okay, good question.
And the lady at the back there.
Okay.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I wanted to ask about the role of women. Were there forest sisters, maybe?
Yes. Okay. I'm gonna take that in reverse order. Yes, there were forest sisters. There was a splendid article about them in Latvia. Not a lot written about it in Estonia, but they did exist. Extensive involvement of women in Lithuania. They were crucial to the movement as liaison, because a single man of military age walking around is very easily, assumed to be a partisan in certain periods of time, and attracts attention. A woman of same age carrying a basket of potatoes from one farm to another, flies under the radar. So women were extensively used for communication and liaison. There are cases where women became, quite active partisans. More than that, there was also situations where women were, there's one particular case of a woman who was actually an infiltrator into the Soviet bureaucracy, getting things like blank passports, things like that. So yes, I think in some of the older partisan literature, they don't get as typically the case with wartime literature, the women don't necessarily get the praise that they should, but it's very much the thing, yes. Okay. Anti-Semitism, yes. Anti-Semitism has always existed in Eastern Europe. It comes and goes. It sort of, it's there if you want to push on it, and I'd say the situation in the 1920s and 1930s in Latvia and Lithuania was pretty good. It was a pretty good period by historical standards for the Jewish community, because they were not under the same restrictions that they had been under the Tsar. So there was, in fact, a blossoming of. There's a blossoming of political movements. There's an economic blossoming. They have rights that they can vote now. So they're more able to attend university. Those things were all strictly circumscribed under the Tsar. So the tendency of anti-Semitism was going down in the interwar period, but. Yes, you're right. Particularly the Catholic Church has got a problematic legacy in Eastern Europe on this, as does the Orthodox Church, as do the Lutheran churches in Latvia, Estonia. So it is a mixed legacy. So when you get somebody pushing hard on the anti-Semitism sort of lever, and combining it with a secular anti-Bolshevism, anti-Soviet lever, and trying to combine and conflate the two. Yeah, there are people that fall for that, and in a situation where the new overlords control the media, it becomes difficult. It's a problem. And sorry, your question was. Oh yes. Okay. So what you get in the early 1990s? I mean, you get all of a sudden in a renaissance, you can start commemorating this stuff. You can actually have museum displays, and you can start writing books about this. And all of a sudden, the people who are still alive can talk about it again. They didn't feel that they could. So you get this mushrooming. And some of it, I'd say it was 90% good, 10% a little bit exaggerated. All of a sudden, everybody had a partisan, and you felt left out if you didn't have a partisan. And some people, I think some of these accounts are, there's a lot of people sort of, not quite necessarily making things up, but embellishing their stories, because all of a sudden it's the popular thing. Oh yeah, I was a partisan back in the day. So there's a little bit of that goes on, but the visible thing is you start to get monuments, and you start to get cemeteries. Okay, so all of a sudden, these remains of partisans in secret graves, and a few people know where they are, can get reinterred in proper cemeteries, and that's a big thing in Lithuania. And it's happening. In fact, this week I think there's another partisan who's been discovered as being buried with military honors in Vilnius. So because it is it gets grasped on as a legacy of the time that we were fighting the guys that we just got rid of. So it becomes a valuable part of the political context. Now, it becomes troublesome in a couple of situations because there's a couple of characters who get commemorated, and then you say, well, what did he do in 1944? So there are a few characters who are, and I do name some names in the book, so there are a few troublesome characters in this. So some people who probably shouldn't have been so commemorated get sort of swept along with it, and that becomes not helpful because that becomes a symbol, something that can be latched on to say, Russian propaganda does make a lot of use out of picking on some of these guys with troublesome records.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm afraid this is all we have time for tonight. Thank you, the audience. Great lecture, great questions. Don't run away.
Yes.
Buy Dan's book, get Dan's signature, and let's continue the discussion afterwards. Big round of applause.